Right, this is the continuation of our lecture on genus Homo. These two species are kind of offshoots. We don't completely, because they are newer discoveries and they have some oddities that we'll talk about. We're not exactly sure where they fit in the human tree of evolution. We'll talk first about Homo naledi. Homo naledi is a very recent discovery. They excavated the rising star chamber between 2015 to present. They are still excavating the site, Dr. Lee Berger and colleagues. Nickname for Homo naledi is the rising star, named after the rising star chamber where it was discovered. And date range is somewhere between 335,000 to about 225,000 years before present. Anatomically speaking, Homo naledi is very similar to Homo habilis and Homo erectus. But the date range obviously is far more recent than Homo habilis or Homo erectus. So the date range is surprising, considering that anatomically speaking, more of a primitive or earlier member of genus Homo based upon the anatomy. So anatomically speaking, we've got a slight degree of constriction behind the brow. We call that post-orbital constriction, slight degree of constriction. The brow ridge is relatively prominent, like you would see in Homo erectus. There is, in some members of naledi, there is a sagittal keel as well. Remember, we have to feel the keel. When we look at it from the side, from the lateral view, we can see that there's a slight degree of prognathism as well. So anatomically speaking, when you look at Homo naledi, pretty similar to Homo habilis and Homo erectus, and also Eragaster as well. You can see a lot of anatomical similarities. Cranial capacity, brain size, is within the range of what you see with Homo habilis, somewhere between 500 to 650 cc's. So it's surprising that Homo naledi has such a recent date range, and also it's very possible that they were engaging in intentional burial practices. So Dr. Lee Berger and colleagues found that in the rising star chamber, first of all, it's very difficult to get to the chamber. There's a section that is only about 7 inches wide. And also within the chamber, they only found remains of Homo naledi. They found a couple owl bones, but other than that, they really only found hominin bones. So that's very typical of what you would see with a burial site. And also it's mainly the very young and the very old, which is also typical of a funerary population. So it is very possible that Homo naledi, that the species was intentionally burying their dead, which is significant because prior to the Homo naledi found, it was believed that really the Neanderthals and Homo sapiens were the first species to intentionally and symbolically bury their dead. So this could be a very big deal to the field of paleoanthropology if we find that these relatively small-brained hominins were engaging in very complex, symbolic, intentional burials. Also from the neck down, the postcranial anatomy is very mosaic, even somewhat resembling the later Australopithecines, and indicating that Homo naledi was a habitual biped and retained some degree of ability to brachiate and locomote in the trees. So again, very surprising that we see this relatively primitive postcranial anatomy, cranial features that are similar to early members of genus Homo, relatively small cranial capacity, but yet very, very recent date range, and also very complex symbolic behavior possibly. Homo floresiensis is the next kind of offshoot or species that we're not exactly sure where they fit in our evolutionary tree. The nickname for Homo floresiensis is the hobbit, and I'll tell you why here in a moment. Date range is somewhere between about 90,000 to as recently as 18,000 years before present. So anatomically speaking, when you turn the skull over and look at the superior view, you see there is a slight degree of constriction. There is a slight degree of zygomatic flare. There's hardly any prognathism, maybe a little bit of midphase prognathism. And overall, when you look at the overall shape, rounded globular cranial shape. Anatomically speaking, Homo floresiensis has also been suggested to be a possible offshoot or branch going off of Homo erectus. The process of island dwarfism is basically based upon the idea that islands are, as an environment, an island is going to have less food resources available in comparison to the mainland. So any organism that lives strictly in the island environment, over time, natural selection will select for a smaller and smaller body size. A smaller body size has lower caloric demands, so that means that if organisms living on the island are smaller, they don't need to consume as many resources in order to survive. So that's beneficial for everyone involved. So the theory is a population or a subset of Homo erectus became isolated on Flores Island in Indonesia, and then over generations, natural selection selected for a smaller and smaller body size. So essentially, Homo floresiensis is a dwarfed version of Homo erectus. So you may also remember from way back at the beginning of the semester we talked about genetic drift. So genetic drift occurs when a subset of a population becomes isolated. More specifically, island dwarfism may be an example of a small population of Homo erectus being genetically and geographically isolated in Flores Island. They also have, Floresiensis has very sophisticated stone tool technology. However, their cranial capacity is only about 380 cc's. But again, the Hobbit is a very dwarfed version, would have stood about 3.5 feet tall at adulthood. So overall small body size and small cranial capacity, sophisticated stone tool technology, possibly an example of island dwarfism, and also a very recent date here. So Homo floresiensis was coexisting with the Neanderthals, obviously different geographical location, but coexisting at the same time as the Neanderthals, as Homo sapiens, possibly as Homo naledi, if Homo naledi was around until more recently. So these two, Homo naledi and Homo floresiensis, are examples of these offshoots that we don't necessarily completely understand where they fit in the evolutionary tree of our history. But of course, we hope that more fossil finds will bring us more information.